Support for Carolina Business Review made possible by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries, headquartered in Hartsville since 1899. And by Business North Carolina Magazine. There's a place for those who subscribe to the theory that business doesn't have to be boring.
Like so many other states across the country, North Carolina continues to cope with a budget crisis. We've heard it all before: revenue shortfalls, statewide job cuts, and partisan bickering. Hello and welcome to the most widely watched business show in the Carolinas. I'm Steve Crump in for Chris William. The governor and the state legislature can't seem to reach an agreement on where to trim spending and save programs as well as jobs. Adding to that equation, it is the first time in more than 100 years Republicans are controlling both the House and the Senate. We get answers from someone who seems to have many of the votes and is crafting the climate as well as spending policies in Raleigh. Speaker of the House, Tom Tillis, is our special guest on this edition of Carolina Business Review.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. And by Novant Health, a not-for-profit group of hospitals and physician clinics, ranked as one of our nation's 10 best healthcare systems, caring for patients and communities in North and South Carolina. Major funding also by King & Spalding, an international law firm with over 800 lawyers in 13 offices worldwide, providing legal services to clients in the Carolinas and throughout the world. For more information, visit www.kslaw.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded May 13th, 2011. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Tom Tillis of the North Carolina House of Representatives.
Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Crump in for Chris William, and we welcome Tom Tillis, the Speaker of the North Carolina House. Before we get into the conversation, a few little factoids about you. You were elected back in 2006. 4 years later, you ascend to power, I guess, with the Republican takeover in Raleigh, and you become Speaker of the House. Welcome.
Thank you.
Talking about the budget issue, where are we right now? Because the House has done its part. It's already gone to the Senate.
We've passed the budget out of our chamber sooner than anyone recalls in recent history, certainly anyone serving back 30 years. It's a budget that gets our spending in line with the revenue. We had to deal with the fact that the stimulus dollars that were used to balance the budget in the past were simply not there. That was about $1.5 billion. And we also have to deal with the fact that there were temporary taxes promised to be sunset on June 30th. We're fulfilling that promise. So we start out with a $3 billion deficit. And in spite of that, what we've done is come up with a budget that we think is balanced, that the community colleges seem to be able to deal with, the K through 12 folks we're working with to try and get them on board with it. It's about a 9.8 or 8.8% cut. And we're still working on the university funding. But on the whole, I'm very pleased with the response to the budget.
Well, one of the things that you've got to be pleased with is the fact that you had some Democrats get on board with you.
I am. And I think a lot of that is because the Democrats who voted with us are the ones who were actively engaged in the budget process. They understood the trade-offs that we had to make, and I believe that was their primary motivation for voting for it.
But at the same time, when you look at what happened earlier this year, especially on the House side, it was not clear sailing at all, simply because, and let me throw in this phrase to see if it makes any sense to you, because there was some numbers that came out, some ideas that basically you guys walked through. Governor Perdue said no, decided to veto it, and the phrase that I want to use is, were the unemployed held hostage in that? Because if you remember, I mean, it basically was a situation where, hey, I'm not going to sign off on that. But at the same time, when Governor Perdue did that, basically you had unemployed people who were unemployed in the state not able to get their benefits.
We're still working on that. And I'll tell you that the issue of extending unemployment benefits is intrinsically linked to the issue of providing stability and job security for state employees across the state and for the people who rely on state services. The whole idea of divorcing those two and thinking they're two separate issues is absurd. What we've proposed is an extension of the unemployment benefits and a framework that, quite honestly, puts both of us in a box, makes it less likely that we'll be bickering and less likely that we'll be going back and forth on budget issues by providing some level of certainty for school systems, for community colleges, for universities, and other areas of the state that need to have roughly some idea of how much money they're going to be able to spend come July 1. That was the whole point between this. Now, having said that, we're moving quickly with the budget. The extension of unemployment benefits will most likely be integrated with the budget that we send to the governor. I had breakfast with the governor yesterday morning and said I'd be happy to consider other things that are more than just her initial position or nothing. That's not good leadership. That's not compromise, and politics is about compromise.
But one of the things, and we talked about this a moment ago, all right, so fine, you have, I believe it was 5 Democrats that got on board with you guys.
Right.
So with that being the case, does this make this latest effort veto-proof?
Well, we'll find out whether or not we're veto-proof based on what comes out of the Senate and the extent to which it is acceptable to the House as a whole, the Republicans and the Democrats that voted with us. I'm actually confident that we will have a budget that those brave members who voted with us the first cycle will be proud of and will defend. And hopefully that we'll get the governor on board with.
You think it's one of those things, though, when I said veto-proof, that at least we're seeing, in North Carolina, what's not happening in Washington?
Well, I think a part of what's happening in Raleigh is something that hasn't occurred for 140 years. It's never occurred, given the modern Republican Party and the modern Democrat Party, having two different parties controlling two co-equal branches of government. So I think a part of what you're seeing, Steve, is just a settling into that reality. And I think that much is made of the bickering, but there's a lot of good government bills that are going through and a lot of bipartisan bills. We passed out yesterday an annexation reform bill that people have been working on for decades.
Yes, they have.
And we got it out with more than 100 vote support and the acquiescence of the League of Municipalities. That's leadership, and that's us stepping up and making sure the compromises are made and we can get these things off our plate so we can focus on other more pressing matters.
Well, let's talk about some of the bleeding, simply because you speak of the whole scenario and where one thing is tied to the other, being unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, tied to even some of the state job cuts. And that is when you look at, I guess, the perception not necessarily being reality, and you talk about job cuts, the Democrats and Raleigh are saying, oh my goodness, it's going to be 30,000. The Republicans are saying 18,000. What's the real deal?
Well, first off, I've told a couple of people they need to work on the math. Anybody in business would look at a projection for having to do a reduction in force. And the first thing you would do is say, based on history, how many people as a percentage of the population retire every year? And
that was the next point as far as attrition, because you have a lot of those positions that are going to be frozen based on retirement.
Well, you've got retirement, you've got attrition that some estimates account for at least half or more of the total jobs that will potentially be eliminated when the budget gets passed. Of the remaining ones, all of those employees will have an opportunity to post for other jobs that will come open and to potentially have an opportunity to remain employed with the state and consistent with other personnel practices in the private sector. And all things equal, a state employee gets that job over somebody who's coming from the outside, and appropriately so.
Where will we see the most drastic cuts? Will it be in Health and Human Services? Is it with school teachers? I mean, and you having, being from Mecklenburg County, serving on the Cornelius Board of Child Commissioners when I remember you from many, many years ago. And what I'm trying to get to is
PTA president after that at Hopewell High School.
Exactly, when it first opened in that area. And I guess what I'm trying to say is you understand the whole level of trickle down, especially living in the great state of Mecklenburg.
Well, let me tell you, I not only understand it, it's also why I didn't condone what the governor proposed in her budget. The governor proposed $100 million roughly of shifting of the cost burden, unfunded mandate, if you will, to the counties and towns that we actually took out of the budget. There is no cost shifting to the counties and towns in this budget, and they applaud us for that. The cost for buses, the cost for tort, the cost for workers' compensation were all clawed back from our budget that was sent out of the House because we don't think it's appropriate to pretend to balance our budget really on the backs of the cities and towns and then put pressure on them to raise taxes. And that's why we took it back.
So in terms of the actual things that will be cut, what are we looking at? What are we hoping in?
Well, first, in Health and Human Services, they did a great job of accelerating things that most of the cuts, half of the cuts roughly, are absorbed through productivity and efficiency measures, working with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Lanier Kanzler. Transportation, what was remarkable to me about this budget was how many people didn't protest it. We didn't have mass protest in Health and Human Services around our general government budget and Diener and Commerce or Justice and Public Safety or Transportation. The issue and where the angst is in education, and you would assume that since it constitutes more than half the budget.
Well, let me put you on the spot here again. Coming back to your roots in Mecklenburg County, just this week, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board, they said, hey, we need another $55 million in spite of everything else. They're going to the county commission to ask for that, and I'm sure that on the receiving end in Raleigh, you guys are expecting some kind of a request. Is it going to be no, the buck stops here, or is this something else that you're seeing from other school systems around the state?
We're seeing some of that. I think you will see one of the things that we did on the last day before the budget passed out was provide about another $35 million to be distributed from the lottery proceeds, which had been redirected to scholarships, which we've got to continue to work on. But the original intent was to get this money down to the counties to support school construction. We've done that again, and we've also implemented a provision in the budget that for some counties that may not need to build an additional school now to have some flexibility to let it defray some of the pressure on operational costs. So we've done that. At the end of the day, I think that the budget that came out of the House, which is roughly about 8.8% for K through 12, I think that is the budget that the local school systems will need to cope with. And what we've done is I had another superintendent of one of our major school systems in my office yesterday, and I've had Pete Gorman there, and I've got 5 or 6 that will be around my conference room table next week to talk about how we can provide further relief through flexibility and other changes that we could make. Regulations coming out of Raleigh, the Department of Public Instruction, the Department of Education, that will make it easier for them to cope with these cuts. But I will tell you, many of them feel like that the cuts that we proposed are within the margins of manageability. And I think that's what we have to deal with when we're in a fiscal crisis.
Talk to me about economic projections. I mean, things aren't as rosy as they were. They're not as bleak as they were. Right. But when you look at some of the telltale signs, the stock market's coming back. You can look at some of the counties around the state. They're saying our tax receipts are improving. What are you seeing on the statewide level?
Well, I tell you, I do think that what we seem to have done is gone into the trough, and we're progressively moving forward. You know, we hope that there's no macroeconomic double dip phenomenon. Let's assume that that's off the table for now. So now it's more a matter of step-level incremental growth. That's why we think it is critical to let the $1.5 billion in taxes that are supposed to expire on June the 30th to expire, because now we've got $1.5 billion more dollars back in the private sector to better position North Carolina to get ahead of the pack in the Southeast region for job growth, for job expansion, for attracting relocations here. That's exactly why we have accelerated regulatory reform outside of the budget. That's why you've seen medical malpractice reform passed out of both houses for the first time in decades. That's why you'll see a workers' compensation reform, which is a consensus bill, business-friendly bills that make it more likely people will take risks, invest, and expand jobs.
Well, let me throw in the other caveat to that, and that's something you've talked about, which is health care reform.
Healthcare reform is still, in my estimation, a ticking time bomb. It takes place on January 1st, 2014. It will add 800,000 Medicaid recipients to the state rolls.
So
nobody knows what that is. Now, the good news is the federal government recognizes that that's going to have some fiscal impact, so we get funding for a couple of years. But then we're on our own. And if we're not structurally prepared for that, then maybe we work through all the change that occurs in 2014. But come 2016, 2017, we could have, unless we've just got an economy that's rising the tide, we could have another fiscal crisis on our hands.
But the other thing is that's working against, I guess, the Republican-controlled House and Senate is the fact that you have a Democratic governor, a Democratic attorney general, who said, based on what we're seeing in some of these other states that's challenging the new federal mandate for health care, they're not going to touch it in the court systems. You think they should?
Well, I think that we need to take a look at it. I do believe it's a government overreach. I think that the president and the leadership in Washington missed a golden opportunity to be a facilitator and to make certain that they wanted changes to occur, but use the various states to try different approaches that made sense, that worked for their demographic, for their economic circumstances, and for their constituents, and then learn the best practices from that. But instead, they've created this a la prima, one-size-fits-all. Boy, I hope they're right, because if they're not, if they're right, they'll succeed tremendously. But if they're wrong, they're going to fail with what I would consider disastrous potential consequences. So there's no hedging here. Imagine a national health care agenda that required states to do something, encouraged them to do something, similar to the way the federal government encouraged the interstate system and building an interstate system in a cooperative way that allowed people to be eligible for funding based on certain clip rates that they achieved in terms of accomplishing reforms in healthcare. They didn't do that. They honestly believe central planning's got it right. Now you guys just have to execute.
But coming back to what you said a moment ago on the whole malpractice side of this thing, where you're doing malpractice reform, can that augment some of this confusion that we may see down the road with healthcare reform?
No, I don't think so. I think the medical malpractice reform that we looked at is pretty focused. It's really to try and take some of the cost out and try to encourage doctors like OBGYNs and other people where their numbers are diminishing to still continue to operate in the state for the purposes of affordable health care, have enough of them, and also literally to have practices where people are not going to have to travel to get the service over time.
Speaking of travel, let's talk about the road situation here, because you see it on both ends. You're the Speaker of the House. You live up on Lake Norman, so you get to drive, from Mecklenburg County down I-40. So you get there, you see 540 and the 440 Beltway and 740, and you say, gosh, we live in the largest city, the largest metropolitan area in North Carolina, and we can't even get a loop called 485 finished.
Right, and keep in mind that most of that unfinished loop is in my district. There's a couple of things. One, I believe that there are legitimate arguments for some of the road funding decisions in the past being politically motivated. Probably not as much as many people believe, but there's a significant number of examples out there where you could see it was power politics. They got the nod and they implemented projects. I think for the most part, we've got two or three things we have to work on. One, the equity formula is outdated. It doesn't really deal well with congestion and safety issues. Whether or not you deal with that by adjusting the equity formula or come up with a different pool is something that we will take up most likely in the short session.
I know that Governor Perdue is hoping to have this thing done by 2014, 2015.
Yeah.
But what's so sad is, and especially as you look at southern Mecklenburg County, the road is already over capacity.
That's right. Well, 485, I think the project, because those contracts, there is a funding mechanism. One of the contracts has already been let. The other one will be let sometime in October for the interchange at I-85. Those are going to happen. And I actually applaud the governor for the work that she did, work that I've done in my office, and everybody else to really move that forward. On a broader basis, though, Steve, we've got to take a look at alternative sources of funding. I think we have to take a serious look at toll roads when they make sense, when they provide an alternative, not the primary route for people to move into and out of. I'm not really in favor of tolling roads that already exist, but I am up for anything that gets us out of this $20 billion deficit for infrastructure.
Well, and you talk about toll roads, and you look at northern Mecklenburg County, your district, and news breaks this week that they're talking about a toll on an HOV lane. Is that feasible?
Well, it's kind of funny because my daughter called me on the carpet this last night.
Really?
When I got, what are you talking about, a toll lane? And she goes to CPCC.
Right.
We live at exit 28 on 77. She goes downtown to a number of her classes. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that particular project. One, it is not tolling the two lanes that are there. It is adding a lane. And it is allowing that lane to be HOV for free and HOT, HOT, high occupancy toll. If you or I decide today traffic looks a little heavy and I want to pay a toll and ride in that lane. Incidentally, without a toll booth. with transponders that will detect that you're actually in that lane and charge you for it if you want that service. Look, if that gets me 50% more potential capacity to go from 2 lanes to 3 lanes and allow people to opt into it. And what was funny when I described this to my daughter, she says, well, wait a minute, then even if I don't use it, there are going to be other people using it. So that should ease some of the burden on the 2 lanes. Absolutely.
All right. So the other side of that is, I mean, because everybody gets angry about traffic, what about the numbers as far as the money? Are there any projections at all as far as reducing some of the issues connected to highway funding?
Well, the problem that we have with highway funding here is we simply don't have enough money going into highway funding. That's another thing I'll tell you. I applaud Rick Killian, who chaired our House Appropriations Transportation Committee. He focused a lot on holding pure highway fund dollars for the purposes of maintenance, repair, and expansion of the interstate or the highway system within North Carolina. But at the end of the day, we don't have enough money coming in for the needs that we have. And that's why tolls, that's why public-private partnerships, that's why design-build contracts, these other things that are being considered have to be on the table. And it may even, some of those may push all of us out of our comfort zones, but in the mix, we've got to figure out a way to solve a problem that's been going on for decades, and the leadership hasn't stepped up and addressed it definitively.
What are we seeing on some of the secondary roads, too? Because everybody thinks interstate, but you got a whole lot of issues in terms of bridges that need to be repaired in this state and even some paving issues on some of our secondary highways.
It's another area where I'm proud of the proposed budget. We actually upped the number of bridges, funding for bridges. We've got a serious problem with the secondary roads for bridges. We went from, I think it was...
some have failed federal testing.
That's right. I think it was, I may be right, I think it was about 50% more bridges are now funded for repair and renovation in this budget than had been previously. I think we went somewhere from around 250 up to about 375. Don't quote me directly on the numbers, but I think proportionately that's about right, because we realize you got to do that base level maintenance. If you don't, you have a more difficult, more costly problem later on.
So where are we right now in terms of what everybody has been calling, I guess, our number one, road construction project, which is the bridge along the Yadkin River on Interstate 85 between Rowan and Davidson County?
It's going well. As a matter of fact, if you ride by there, as I do, at least once a week, you'll see the temporary bridge that they're creating for the purposes of getting the main bridge going. It's funded. It's been let. They're moving aggressively. It's going to take a couple of years to get it done, but it's going to have a tremendous impact on that corridor. I'm telling you, sometimes I go 40 down 77 and add 10, 20 minutes to the trip, because I know that it's more likely to at least only be 10 or 20-minute delay versus some of the delays they have now going over that river.
We got a couple of minutes left here, and I want to ask you, based on some of the budget information that you've passed along here, what's the credo from Raleigh? Is it the same thing that we're finding in corporate America? You're a former IBM executive. Is it the whole idea of doing less with more?
Yeah, and I think it's doing.
Doing more with less.
I think it's and I think it's also doing the right things with what you have. One of the things in this budget, a misconception, I think, among people is that we would want to restore all the money and have exactly the same level of spending as existed in the last cycle. I don't agree with that. We've seen a lot of waste. We've seen a lot of misdirected priorities and other things that simply never should have been in there. And if they hadn't, then you'd have less of a structural deficit. You'd have more money in the rainy day fund. You'd have more money in repairs and renovations. We didn't even talk about that. This budget has set aside more money for repairs and renovations, more money in the rainy day fund. The past 2 budgets that I've been involved with didn't even satisfy the statutory limits. You've literally been taken to court for failing to do it. And we've done that. So, I think a part of what we're talking about is, maybe we'd like to spend a little bit more, but we love the idea that we're reducing the tax burden. We love the idea that we're actually making sure that those good government's fiscally sound decisions around repairs and renovations, rainy day fund, those sorts of things are adequately funded going into next year.
And at that point, Tom Tillis, we are out of time here. Thanks so much for your honesty, your candor. We look forward to see you guys continuing to build bridges in Raleigh, and perhaps you'll have more than 5 Democrats on your next budget cycle.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right. That's Carolina Business Review for this week. I'm Steve Crump in for Chris William. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. And by Novant Health, a not-for-profit group of hospitals and physician clinics, ranked as one of our nation's 10 best healthcare systems, caring for patients and communities in North and South Carolina. Major funding also by King & Spalding, an international law firm with over 800 lawyers in 13 offices worldwide, providing legal services to clients in the Carolinas and throughout the world. For more information, visit www.kslaw.com. Additional funding provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. There's a place for those who subscribe to the theory that business doesn't have to be boring. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries, headquartered in Hartsville since 1899. And by viewers like you. Thank you. You may write us at Carolina Business Review, 3242 Commonwealth Avenue, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28205.